What began as a heated WNBA matchup quickly turned into a controversy nobody saw coming. Sophie Cunningham went down after a hard foul from DiJonai Carrington, and within minutes, Carrington was ejected. But then came the moment that sent the entire story into overdrive. 2 words: white privilege. Suddenly, this wasn't just about basketball anymore.
An absolute disgrace. That's what one fan is calling the decision from referees during this moment at a WNBA game on Saturday.
Days later, more questions followed as Carrington became involved in additional controversial plays, a technical foul, and a strange courtside fan incident. With every moment going viral, critics began asking whether this was becoming a dangerous pattern or whether Carrington was simply being judged under an enormous spotlight. Now, the Fever rematch could reignite everything. The night Carrington went viral. On August 8, 2026, the Chicago Sky hosted the Indiana Fever at the United Center, a rivalry game that, on paper, had nothing unusual riding on it beyond the standings. Less than 3 minutes into the game, Sophie Cunningham broke free on a fast break, a clean lane opening up in front of her. DiJonai Carrington came from behind, swiping at the ball, and instead caught Cunningham across the head and neck. Cunningham hit the floor hard, popped back up furious, and confronted Carrington directly, the 2 players grabbing onto each other before a teammate pulled them apart. Officials initially called it a flagrant 1.
The defensive foul on DiJonai Carrington has been upgraded to a flagrant foul penalty 2.
The kind of call that happens several times in any given week around the league and rarely generates a headline of its own. Head referee Maj Forsberg pulled the play for a video review anyway, unwilling to let the initial read stand without a second look, and upgraded it, citing wind-up, impact, and follow-through on a player in a vulnerable position. The specific 3-part standard the league uses to distinguish a hard basketball play from something that crosses the line into a flagrant 2. Flagrant 2, automatic ejection. Carrington had played 3 minutes. Minutes later, from inside that locker room, Carrington posted 2 words that turned a basketball incident into something much bigger: white privilege, tagging the Fever directly. Given that Carrington is black and Cunningham is white, the post read to many as a direct accusation that the officiating itself, or the reaction to it, had been shaped by race, and it detonated across WNBA media within the hour, spreading well beyond basketball circles into general political and cultural commentary almost immediately. A former NFL player publicly tore into her for it, writing that the moment was a prime example of why we can't ever move forward as a country. Others defended the post as a legitimate reaction to a broader pattern of uneven treatment across the league, pointing to Cunningham's own high public profile as part of the context. Carrington didn't apologize or delete it. 2 days later, speaking to reporters, she softened the framing, insisting she'd never meant that the flagrant 2 call itself was the product of white privilege, just that the broader reaction to it felt uneven. Whether that walkback changed anyone's mind is doubtful. The 2 words were already the headline, and headlines don't unpost themselves. The league, notably, said nothing further. No suspension, no additional fine beyond the automatic $1,000 penalty attached to a flagrant 2.
Now back to Sophie Cunningham, who sparked this entire issue by stating a common-sense position in a thoughtful and compassionate way.
That silence was itself part of the story for a lot of observers. After a week already dominated by questions about how the WNBA handles controversy involving its own players, a hard foul with a viral race-charged aftermath, drawing zero additional comment from the league office felt, to critics, like a pattern of its own. Carrington was back on the floor 2 days later against Seattle, dropping a career-high 26 points off the bench in a losing effort. For a moment, it looked like the story might actually cool off on its own. A hard foul, a controversial post, a strong response on the court, and a league content to let the whole thing quietly pass. It didn't get the chance to pass, because 4 days after the Cunningham foul, Carrington was back in the headlines, not for one new incident, but for 2, in the same game, against a completely different opponent, in a way that made the entire Cunningham conversation feel unfinished all over again. This also wasn't the first time Carrington's physicality had drawn this kind of scrutiny. Earlier in the season, commentator Jason Whitlock had already flagged a similar concern after separate hard fouls she'd committed against other guards, warning publicly that the league needed to get ahead of what he saw as a developing tendency before someone got seriously hurt. To fans who remembered that earlier warning, the Cunningham hit didn't look like a first offense at all. It looked like the exact outcome Whitlock had predicted months before it happened. Against that backdrop, everything that followed in the days after August 8th carried a different weight than it would have for a player with a cleaner recent history. Carrington can't escape the spotlight. On August 13th, the Sky traveled to face the Golden State Valkyries and lost badly, 91-71, a blowout that, under normal circumstances, would have barely registered as its own news story. During the game, Carrington made contact with Valkyries forward Cecilia Zandalasini's face while swiping at the ball on a defensive possession, an offhand positioned, according to observers watching the replay, in a spot that made it physically difficult to actually reach the ball without going through Zandalasini's face first. Clips of the moment circulated within minutes, framed by critics as further proof of a pattern rather than an isolated incident, dissected frame by frame in exactly the kind of detail a routine defensive swipe from an uncontroversial player would never receive. No flagrant was called, no common foul. According to multiple reports, the play simply continued, officials apparently seeing nothing on the floor worth stopping the game for, a judgment call that, whatever its merits,
and then she put both hands up right after. But that's DiJonai's not doing things half speed, right?
No.
Like she's swinging hard.
guaranteed the moment would be argued about far more intensely online than it ever was on the court in real time. That's worth sitting with, because it complicates the loudest version of this story circulating online. The version that turned uncalled contact drawing outrage into 2 new fouls, as though officials had actually blown a whistle and walked away without further discipline. Neither of Carrington's face-adjacent contacts against Golden State resulted in an official foul call of any kind, which means the headline claiming she picked up 2 new fouls that night isn't quite accurate. What actually happened was narrower, and in some ways stranger, contact serious enough to draw viral replay clips and outraged commentary, waved off by officials in real time as nothing worth a whistle. Whether that says more about officiating consistency, about how quickly a controversial player gets the benefit of the doubt reversed, or simply about how fast one bad week can make every subsequent play look worse than it actually was, is exactly the question this entire story keeps circling back to without ever fully answering. The one call that did land came later, in the third quarter, with 1 minute and 26 seconds remaining. Carrington attacked the basket, missed, and reacted badly to what she believed should have been a foul call in her favor. The kind of reaction that, on a normal night for a normal player, might draw a warning at most. The referees disagreed and hit her with a technical instead, her second of the season, carrying a $500 fine. It capped an already rough shooting night. She finished with just 3 points off the bench, a quiet stat line for a player who, 4 days earlier, had been the single most talked about person in the entire league, on a night where the only thing anyone actually wanted to talk about was everything except the final score. Not everyone was content to wave off the uncalled contact the way the officials had. WNBA reporter Annie Costabile, writing about the league's handling of the entire Cunningham situation days earlier, had already argued the original ejection was the correct call, not primarily because of proven intent, but because, in her words, the risk of injury was very real regardless of what Carrington meant to do. That framing matters here specifically because it shifts the entire question away from motive and toward outcome. Applied to the Golden State game, that same logic cuts both ways. If injury risk matters more than provable intent, then an uncalled hit to the face is still a hit to the face, whistle or no whistle, which means the absence of an official foul call doesn't actually settle whether the contact itself was dangerous.
DiJonai Carrington waxed Hayes in face, no flagrant, after review. Wait a minute, when was this?
The fan incident nobody saw coming. The uncalled contact wasn't even the strangest moment of that night. With under 9 minutes left in the fourth quarter, Carrington walked over to referee Sarah Williams during a stoppage and pointed toward a man sitting courtside. Chicago Sky and Chase Center security moved in immediately, and the fan was escorted out of his seat and into the tunnel in full view of the broadcast cameras. A moment that, on its own, was jarring enough to briefly overshadow the basketball being played around it. He didn't stay gone. After security investigated, the complaint was determined to be unfounded, and the fan was allowed to return to his seat before the game ended. No verified evidence ever surfaced that he'd made any comment referencing the Cunningham incident, race, or anything else connected to the week's controversy. It was, as far as any public reporting has established, a dead end. A fan removed, then quietly unremoved, with no public explanation ever offered for what exactly he was accused of saying in the first place. Is that nothing, or is it something? On one hand, this wasn't unprecedented. 5 days earlier, a different WNBA player had pointed out a different courtside fan under nearly identical circumstances during a separate game. That fan was also escorted out, and that complaint was also eventually deemed unfounded after security spoke with witnesses nearby. Security responding to a player's in-game complaint and later clearing the fan isn't automatically suspicious. It's closer to standard procedure working as designed, twice, in the same week, for 2 different players in 2 different arenas, under a security protocol that exists precisely to take player complaints seriously without automatically assuming guilt. On the other hand, layered on top of an ejection, a viral race-charged social media post, and 2 uncalled contact incidents in the same month, it's easy to see why a fan getting pulled from his seat over Carrington specifically became one more data point in a week that had no shortage of them. Context doesn't erase an incident. It just changes how loudly people talk about it. And by August 13th, everything involving Carrington was already being talked about loudly. There's a version of this moment that gets lost in the noise entirely. A security protocol functioning correctly, investigating a complaint, finding nothing, and reversing course within the same game. That's not a scandal. That's the system working as intended, twice in 1 week, for 2 unrelated players. But intent and perception rarely travel together in a story this loud.
Sizing up Williams, attacking, acrobatic finish and foul!
And by the time the broadcast cameras caught a man being walked out of his own seat, the moment had already been clipped, captioned, and shared thousands of times before anyone knew whether the complaint held up at all. It's worth asking what a fairer version of this moment might have looked like. Not necessarily a different outcome, but a different pace. A complaint investigated quietly, resolved before it ever reached a broadcast camera, wouldn't have generated a single headline. Instead, the sequence played out entirely in public. Accusation, response, removal, and reversal, all inside one live broadcast, all available for instant replay and instant judgment before the actual facts had even been established. That's not necessarily anyone's fault specifically. It's simply what live sports broadcasting looks like now, for better and for worse, when a player already at the center of one controversy generates a second one in the same week. Was Cunningham right all along? The debate surrounding DiJonai Carrington has now moved beyond one controversial play. What happened against Sophie Cunningham became a major flashpoint, but the attention has not disappeared. Instead, 2 more questionable moments in the Golden State game have put Carrington's defensive style under an even bigger microscope. Cunningham's position has never been particularly difficult to understand. After the original flagrant 2 foul, she confronted Carrington almost immediately, and since then she has repeatedly maintained that the contact appeared intentional rather than accidental. Carrington has strongly rejected that interpretation. Her explanation has remained consistent. She was making a basketball play, she did not deliberately target anyone's head, and her physical style of defense has always involved aggressive contact. That distinction matters because Carrington did not suddenly become a physical defender this month. That has been part of her identity throughout her career. She built her reputation on relentless perimeter defense, pressure, quick hands, and a willingness to make opponents uncomfortable. Coaches have valued that intensity because it can completely disrupt an opposing team's offense. But now the question is whether that same intensity has crossed a line. The argument against Carrington is becoming easier to make because of the timing. Within a matter of days, she was involved in contact involving the faces of 3 different players. One incident resulted in an ejection, while 2 additional plays against Golden State went uncalled but attracted significant attention when viewers slowed down the replays. And that changes the conversation. One isolated hard foul can happen to almost anyone. Basketball is a physical sport, and even disciplined defenders occasionally mistime a challenge or make contact they never intended to make. But when multiple incidents appear close together, people naturally start asking whether they are looking at a pattern rather than an accident. That is where Cunningham's original criticism gains new relevance. If Carrington's physical approach repeatedly produces dangerous contact, perhaps Cunningham was not simply reacting emotionally in the moment. Perhaps she recognized a genuine problem before everyone else was paying attention. But there is another side to this story. Carrington's supporters can argue that the current scrutiny is changing how every one of her defensive plays is being interpreted. Before this controversy, her aggressive defense was often viewed as one of her greatest strengths.
10 to shoot. Boston looking for help. Out to Cunningham. The repost with 5. Boston spinning in.
The same physicality that is now being criticized helped establish her reputation as one of the league's toughest perimeter defenders. Once a player becomes the center of a controversy, however, everything changes. Every replay gets examined. Every hand movement gets slowed down. Every collision becomes potential evidence. A play that might have disappeared into the normal rhythm of a basketball game suddenly becomes a headline. That raises an important question. Is Carrington actually playing more dangerously, or are people simply watching her more closely? The answer may be somewhere in the middle. Carrington can be an elite, high-energy defender while also occasionally crossing the line. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Her aggressive style can be exactly what makes her valuable, while also creating situations where hard contact becomes more likely. And that may be the real issue the WNBA now has to confront. The question isn't whether Carrington is a physical player. She clearly is. The question is where the league draws the boundary between aggressive defense and unnecessary contact. For now, Cunningham's criticism remains a debate rather than a proven conclusion. The Golden State incidents did not definitively establish intent, but they have added fuel to an argument that was already raging. And with every new replay, the spotlight on Carrington only gets brighter. The Fever rematch changes everything. The technical foul doesn't move Carrington toward a flagrant-related suspension. Those 2 penalty tracks run separately under league rules, tallied on entirely different clocks that only intersect at the point of actual games missed. But she's not far from real consequences on either one. A flagrant 2 carries 2 flagrant points, and players face a 1-game suspension once they accumulate enough of them across a season. Carrington is now just 2 points away from that threshold on the flagrant side alone, with technicals building on a completely separate clock behind her, currently at 2 of the 8 that would eventually trigger a suspension of their own, alongside escalating fines that climb from $500 per technical to $1,000 and eventually $1,500 once the threshold is crossed. One more significant incident on either track, and this stops being a media controversy and starts being a lineup problem for a Chicago team that needs her available, particularly with the Sky fighting to stay relevant in a crowded playoff picture. The schedule isn't offering much of a cool-down period either. The Sky and the Fever are already set to meet again before the month is out. The same 2 teams, the same 2 players, on the same court where this entire chapter started. Whatever's actually true about intent, pattern, or scrutiny bias will get another live test the moment Carrington and Cunningham share a floor again, in front of a crowd that hasn't forgotten a single detail of how this started, and in front of officials who will be under just as much scrutiny as either player for how they call the very first hard screen or contested rebound between them. Chicago, for its part, hasn't publicly addressed any of this beyond the standard post-game availability quotes. No organizational statement on the fan incident, no comment on the uncalled contact against Golden State. That silence mirrors the league's own approach to the original Cunningham foul. Say as little as possible, let the news cycle move on to the next controversy, and hope the next several games are quiet enough that nobody has reason to revisit any of it. Given how the last 2 weeks have gone, that's a bet the Sky's own recent history suggests they shouldn't be making with much confidence. A team already navigating a crowded playoff picture can't afford many more weeks built around off-court headlines instead of on-court results. And every day this story stays alive is another day the conversation around Chicago has nothing to do with wins and losses. There's also a broader institutional question sitting underneath all of it that has nothing to do with Carrington specifically. If a player under this much scrutiny can generate 2 viral uncalled contact incidents in a single game without officials stopping play, what does that say about how closely the league is actually watching its own most controversial storylines in real time, as opposed to after the fact, once social media has already made the decision for them? A league office that only reacts once a clip has gone viral isn't officiating in the moment. It's managing a reputation after the fact, which is a very different job, and one that leaves every player, not just Carrington,
Yo, I don't know what DiJonai Carrington is doing right now, man, but this is crazy.
Subject to a standard that shifts depending on how loud the internet gets that week. That inconsistency cuts in more than one direction too. A league that waits for public outrage before treating a contact play seriously risks training its most controversial players to expect exactly that pattern. Quiet if nobody's watching closely. Consequences only once a clip crosses a certain threshold of attention. Whether that's actually happening here, or whether officials genuinely saw 2 plays that simply didn't rise to the level of a foul under the rules as written, is impossible to settle definitively from outside the officiating booth. What isn't in dispute is that the standard, whatever it actually is, looked very different from the outside watching a broadcast replay than it apparently did to the 3 officials standing closest to the play. 1 foul actually called, 2 more that weren't. A fan removed, then quietly returned. That's the scoreboard from 4 days that turned 1 hard hit into a pattern question. Cunningham never wavered from her read that the contact was intentional.
Sophie Cunningham wasn't backing down from any of that smoke, and she was cooking herself.
Carrington never wavered from hers that it wasn't. The tape hasn't settled it either way. It's made the argument louder, handing both sides more to point to next time. With the Fever rematch already scheduled, this isn't cooling off soon. Was Sophie right? Or is Carrington just playing under a bigger spotlight? Tell us in the comments, subscribe for the next chapter, and hit like if this connected the dots.